Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, and I'm joined by
City Hall reporter Joshua Fechter.
Reporter Brian Chasnoff.
I think you were hesitating about the title. Yeah.
I'm simplifying from here on out.
You've been wearing a lot of hats lately.
I'm just a
good.
reporter.
Yeah.
That's
Well, this is our the Thanksgiving week episode of our podcast, and we're thankful to be joined today by a special guest, District 5 Councilwoman Shirley Gonzales. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I think we talked a little bit about it before we started. Any special Thanksgiving plans this week?
We will be home celebrating with family, and we do the official Christmas tree lighting on Friday, and we do the lighting of the Riverwalk. And so it's a really great time to be in San Antonio, and the weather's fabulous.
Oh, yes, it is.
So if anybody has any thoughts about where they should spend their holiday, come on over to San Antonio. It's just a beautiful place to
And
be.
the West Side is a good place.
But there's lots of celebrations, and it's just a great time to be in San Antonio over the holidays.
Well, I guess the most pressing news as far as the city goes, last Friday we had a temporary injunction from District Judge Peter Sakai, basically putting a hold on the city's paid sick leave ordinance. And the history behind this is the council passed a paid sick leave ordinance in August of 2018, revised it in October, and it was set to go into effect on December 1st, which is, I guess, a Saturday.
Yep.
And that's now in limbo. And so, Shirley, I want to kind of get your thoughts on that decision and where you think things stand now.
Well, I was a reluctant supporter of the ordinance. Mm-hmm. I'm a small business owner myself, and my concern was always on the compliance side and the enforcement side, and what would an enforcement look like. So I was particularly concerned that we would have officers coming into our businesses and demanding to see payroll information. Mm-hmm. I mentioned this to the organizations that were working on this issue, given the fact that in District 5, the majority of our buildings were built before 1970, and I suspect some of the buildings are not in compliance. I also was concerned about asking for payroll information in a city where we know we have a large undocumented population. We don't know what those numbers are like. So I was supportive of the ordinance, always supportive of local control, but very reluctant on the enforcement side. So when the injunction came down, is that the right word?
Injunction.
Yeah.
Injunction.
So from Judge Sakai, I was sad because I believe that was the city ordinance. We were trying to make an impact for the workers in San Antonio. And so now it looks like Councilmember Sandoval really was the lead on this particular issue, had several of us sign a CCR moving forward at least with the investigation of whether or not we could require it of city contractors.
And so this would be city, possibly also including SAWS and CPS Energy, or at least looking into the possibility of requiring that businesses that have contracts with the city or with those agencies would have to comply with paid sick leave.
Right, and see if at least that part would be legal and enforceable. So we're still getting the information on that. That was just on Friday afternoon. And so but we did file the CCR with the support of Councilmember Trevino, Cabello Haverda, and Jada Andrew Sullivan.
Councilman Pelaez didn't appreciate that very much, did he?
No.
What was his metaphor again?
He basically just said, the day an injunction like this comes down is probably not the time to do a major policy proposal. So,
Right.
So how did you feel about basically that sentiment that he expressed?
Well, he always had that position, so no surprise there. I mean, in fact, I thought it was very odd that he chaired the committee, this ad hoc committee, because he was really had been from the beginning opposed to the opposed to it. So no surprise that he made a comment about it, but I did think it was odd that he continued to chair the committee, even though he was not supportive of it.
I guess at the heart of the legal issue here is, the state has a minimum wage law, and the argument has been made that by mandating a certain number of hours of paid sick time that the city is kind of violating the state law by sort of adding to the pay for people, or they're reducing the hours so the actual pay per hour goes up. I mean, I guess the question has been whether we look at paid sick leave as a benefit, which is the way I've always thought of it, or whether it's a wage, which is, I guess, the legal challenge on this.
It's a pretty abstract, argument.
I mean, how do you see that?
Well, I understand what the law says, and at the same time, we support local control. So I think it's obviously questionable whether or not it was legal. It was brought up many, many times, whether it was legal. And also a reminder to everyone that this was not something that the council tried to adopt, that this was brought to us by petition. So we only had a few alternatives, was whether to accept it as an ordinance and then try to adjust it to something that would be legal later on down the road, or to allow it to go on the ballot, which would have been much more complicated because I'm sure everybody knows here all the issues that were going on at that time, and having something else on the ballot. But then what happens to the legal challenges at that time when we're trying to adopt something that's not entirely legal?
Any sense about what the city's next step is going to be?
So, we'll proceed with our ordinance, and we're still waiting to hear from the legal opinion of our city attorneys.
Right.
We've not heard that yet, other than they reviewed the language that Councilwoman Sandoval had in her CCR, and then see what the legal opinion is of our city attorneys.
Now, on October 8th, you and Councilwoman Rebecca Villagran filed a council consideration request calling for a study looking into the issue of pay equity. And if you could talk a little bit about the challenges that San Antonio has with pay equity and what you would ideally like to see come about with this.
Well, in the same way that we have the ordinance or the CCR that was signed by Councilwoman Sandoval asking for the recommendations that city contractors, CPS and SAWS look into whether or not it's legal to have a paid sick leave, we could ask for the same request for women and pay parity in that regard. Are women being paid sufficiently based on their education? Are they being paid equal to men in the jobs that they provide? And then what impact does it have on our city when we know that women are being significantly underpaid?
Is it true that Latinas have an even lower?
Yeah, 54%. And, I think we've always known that inherently, but when the numbers are so stark and we see that it takes 23 months for us to earn the same as a non-white, non-Hispanic male, it's really discouraging, because we all know that women are doing such significant work in the city as it relates to nonprofits and also all the unpaid work that we do at home and in our schools. And
What do you have any theories on why this is?
Well, I think this theory that I came up with after looking at the data and trying to analyze it is it's just sexism. And so how do we change that? And it's such a heavy lift when all the information that we have, everything points to this very obvious reduction in pay, and that the only solution we come up with is it's sexism alive and well in this city and, of course, cities all over the country.
So what's the solution to sexism on a government level?
Well, I think that we have to be able to mandate and require cities to disclose not cities, but companies to disclose what the pay scale is, and acknowledge if they're significantly underpaying women, and if they are, require them to make that change. So, the requirement side, I think we're going to run into the same legal arguments that we do for the pay parity, for the paid sick leave. But, perhaps if women all over the country are saying, like, we've had enough, we want full disclosure. How much are you paying people? How much are you paying women? And we demand equal pay.
And so would this work in a similar way to Councilwoman Sandoval's proposal on paid sick leave, and that it would be applied to companies trying to do business with the city, and possibly also for city staffers, that the city itself would try to set
right.
that.
And so we would start at the city to look internally, how are we doing? So according to Eric, one of the reasons why we do see such pay parity in the city, or such a low pay in the city, is because of police and fire. Public safety make up about 25% of our workforce, and yet there's very few women in those particular fields, which is in it and of itself is a problem, that there's not enough women in law enforcement and in the firefighters And also that they tend to be male-dominated jobs.
Right.
And so when you have male-dominated jobs and then women-dominated jobs, then you see a pay discrepancy in those numbers as well. So I know that the police chief and fire chief have both said that they've been making big efforts to try to increase the number of women in the workforce, but clearly they're not doing enough, because I know as long as I've been on the council, they've said that they have an initiative to make this change, and it hasn't happened. Very little. I want to say, from 3% to 6%, and say they doubled it, but very, very low.
What's interesting to me about this is that when you talk about, disparities in pay based on gender within the workplace, it's often, you're in a private business, you're in a place that doesn't publish these salaries for the public. You're often you're guessing and suspecting that you're not getting paid as much as your male colleagues. Have you heard from, individual city workers on I looked up my salary and looked up what, my colleague who was doing the same job, what kind of psychological impact that has?
Well, and the reality is no, a lot of people haven't, but and I think this really goes back to the sexism issue, is that women don't feel empowered to go and just ask, am I getting paid the same for this other person who's doing the same job? And because, women have been discriminated against in many fields, they don't have the confidence to just go forward and say, I'm not only do I want the same as this person, but given the work that I've been doing, I want 20% more or something along those lines. So we have a long way to go as it relates to that, and empowering women to ask for more pay.
Right. Well, in terms of that sort of information being out there, I mean, you can go and look it up. Why is it, do you think, taken so long for this issue to be addressed? So, I mean, I still feel like it goes back to sexism. And so in the same way that we know that racism alive and well in this country, I think we see that every day at the national level, but that sexism is too. And so how we start making those changes is to, first of all, have the information available. And that's what the Status of Women report did, and now the pay parity report that the YWCA is working on, to show really where are the fields, have the information so that people recognize when they're being underpaid.
On a related topic, when we're talking about working conditions, we've heard in the last week about there's a little bit of a movement happening among city council staffers. I think they're getting some legal representation to address the issue, which is an old issue, but what status city council staffers should have. Should they be contract workers, which they have been, or should they be city staffers? Should they have that status? And I guess there's some differences as far as pay scales and benefits and so on. How do you follow? I mean, I know you've had loyal staffers who've been with you for a long time, but how do you look at this issue?
With the pay parity issue as well, we would look internally at our own staff and really require all the council members to present the information as well. Are they paying women the same for the same job? So that would be, I think, maybe enlightening as well, is how our own internal staff gets paid. And as far as the I know this has been an issue that's been going on for a while. Over the years, we've seen an increase in pay for our own internal staff. I'm very grateful for that. Trevino tried to make a comparison from what our city's council staff members do and then what city staff members do, and actually they're very different. Yeah. So I didn't agree with that that attempt or that sort of analysis, but of course I believe in paying people as much as we can for the work that they do. And so we'll see where that leads. There's a lot of issues, of course, going on there as well. They are contract employees. They sign a contract sometimes multiple times a year.
They're really working for that one council member. They
are working for the council member, and a lot of it on the side is political work.
One of the things that I was just thinking of, which I think I know has been a frustration or maybe a source of anxiety for some council staffers, because we've had some who've worked for 10, 15, 20 years for various council members, is the fact that there's maybe a lack of job security, because you your council member may only be there for a short time. They may not decide to run, seek re-election. And you're often in that situation as a council staffer where you don't know from one year to the next, who you're going to be working for, or if you'll have a job at City Hall. And I don't know the best way to deal with it. I guess maybe giving them city staff status would change that in some way, but then that gets complicated too.
It does, and so I'm not opposed to that staff becoming city employees. I think it does get very complicated. The job security issue is always at the forefront, and then it does make it difficult for people to plan for their future. But at the same time, that is the nature of the job. Political work is always unstable, and we know that people make their careers out of being political consultants and analysts and field workers.
True.
And it's not stable work. It definitely doesn't have insurance, and it doesn't have job security. And then even, of course, you could have done a great job and your candidate could still lose. Yeah. So it is true. One of those tricky things, but I know that there are ways to address it just as being contract employees with certain benefits, but still at the will of the council member to hire and fire. So it can be done. We may be moving in that direction, but I'm sort of open. I'm open to whatever is the best scenario for the people who are working, but they also do get paid for the most part much less than a city employee.
Yeah. Are you satisfied with the budget that you have as a council member to be able for your staff?
I am. I am. I'm comfortable with it. I think that we can pay the people that work full time enough, and then there's people that work part-time for me that only do communications, some that only do event planning, and some that only do the more complicated constituent work. And so I think it's fair. I'm comfortable with it. I'm also term limited, so I feel like that can be left to the next council member who really wants to focus a lot of attention on it, since I am running out of time.
What about the prohibition on city employees from engaging in campaign work? Would you want to see, council aides carved out of that? How would you like to see?
I think they would have to. I do. I think they would have to, because it is taxpayers' dollars, and I don't think that we should mix the two. And I think it's important that if they are city employees, that they have the same restrictions as any city employee to not participate in municipal politics. But I would hope that they could participate in politics at other levels.
Right. One of the issues you've been really involved in recent months, and one kind of get a sense from you where you think things stand out, has been the issue of bike lanes on Lower Broadway. I think our listeners know we've talked a lot about this issue, which involves the 2017 bond program. It was a $42 million bond for Lower Broadway, I believe. And there's like a 1 mile stretch of this 3 mile Broadway project that's really been the contentious issue, because Broadway does narrow quite a bit from about 110 feet to 70 some feet, and so there have been questions about whether we had room on that section of Broadway for protected bike lanes, and this is something that you've really championed. Where do things stand now? And if you could explain to people why you think it's really important that bike lanes be included on that section of Broadway. So
we know that we must adapt as a city, and we must adapt to allow for alternative modes of transportation. It was possible to have 4 lanes for automobiles, bike lanes, and significant sidewalks. There was room for that. The engineers came up with all kinds of scenarios as to why one was more dangerous than the other. There were alternatives for all of those. The issue really came up was that reducing the number of lanes really led to a decline in level of service. And that's it. It led to a decline of automobiles transporting through the area. So level of service just means how long it takes you to cycle through a light. And what we do know is that by reducing lanes and significantly slowing down the traffic on Broadway, it would have declined the level of service for automobiles in the area. And so if we're really serious about transforming our city for the long term, we need to consider something other than level of service in designing our streets.
Was there a question about congestion as well?
Well, congestion related to level of service. Right. So we know that level of service would mean that cars would have to move more slowly through a light.
How badly?
It was, I since I'm not a traffic engineer, I don't know what exactly all the terms were, but if we wanted to not so significantly change the level of service, it would have required at least a 25% mode shift. So that means people coming to the area would have to do something other than private vehicle, which is a big lift, truly.
And did you? It was part of the appeal of your position on this, the idea that it would maybe help to make people change their habits. That people are, because we are so wedded to our cars in San Antonio and throughout Texas.
Well, we do have to insist on a mode shift, but I also believe that particular section of Broadway really lends itself to a highly walkable, sort of transit-oriented development where level of service was probably not needed. We could have determined whether or not what was the economic impact of the street design, what would have brought more people to the area, what was it equitable? Did it reduce vehicle miles traveled? Other things that would have inspired more people to come to the area. It does require a mode shift, but it also could have been viewed from a completely different perspective, unrelated to cars.
One of the things about the bond language, which I think is common in with these kind of programs, is there was some ambiguity. There was reference to bicycle amenities, but I think it said whenever were appropriate, something like that, which can be interpreted in different ways. Is it your feeling that people on city staff had sort of read that language or just predetermined early on in this process that bike lanes were not going to work in that section of Broadway, and everything kind of followed from there?
Yes, because they use level of service to determine the function of the street. So one thing I have been trying to talk to Eric and the transportation department is to remove level of service from their quality and characteristics of street design. So more importantly, does it connect people to services? Does it bring economic impact to the area? Is it equitable? Does it reduce vehicle miles traveled? All the other qualities that you can use in street design, but we just don't do it here in San Antonio, and most cities don't. In fact, California, as of July 2020, will no longer use level of service to determine street design. And so, as I've mentioned many times, $600 million of our bond money went to streets. And so that means $600 million of our city is going to be determined by traffic engineers. And is that really the kind of city that we want and that we should be for the future? And so what would it look like if $600 million were actually spent on connecting people to services and equity and economic impact to the area versus trying to get people out of an area as quickly as possible?
2 weeks ago, the council approved what was an alternative plan, which I think was favored by the city staff, which was to reroute bicyclists onto Avenue B, have bike lanes there, and North Alamo. And the entire council voted for that. And I know in talking to you that you didn't think it was an either or, that you thought supporting bike lanes on Avenue B didn't necessarily, it didn't mean that it had to be there as opposed to Broadway. I think you thought that you could do both maybe. But because that decision was made by the council, does that end the issue for Lower Broadway, or where do things stand?
I think it effectively ends the conversation. Although I really didn't think that they should have been together. The idea, if you're a cyclist in San Antonio and you cycle for recreation, riding down Broadway or around Brackenridge Park, there's a lovely street grid along Brackenridge Park. It connects to Avenue B. It's quite lovely to pedal down there to get to the Pearl. I do it very often. My children are both at school off of Broadway. And sometimes on Fridays we pedal over and then we end up at the Pearl and it's lovely. Mm-hmm. But it's not for transportation. It's not a route that you would take if you were trying to actually arrive at a destination. It's a lovely stroll for cyclists to pedal along. So the way that it works is that an issue comes to a committee, and the committee makes a recommendation to move it to the full council. I had been trying to get answers to Broadway since we came back from the break in August. My very first meeting was a briefing on Broadway. Staff was supposed to come back with feedback. They didn't. I pushed it back again and said, report to us the information that was requested by the mayor and the council and report back so that we can make an informed decision about whether or not we bring this to the full council. Well, that didn't come out of committee and effectively then died there, because the idea is that you move forward with a recommendation from the committee. If you don't have one, then you're not likely to get a support of the full council because you didn't get a recommendation out of the committee on bike lanes on Lower Broadway. So the Avenue B is lovely, and it's additional $6 million. I mean, it's a lot of money that effectively went to that same contractor. It didn't have to go through an RFP process. It didn't have. I mean, it's $6 million is huge. It could have gone to another business, maybe a small business that could have designed that street. But I did support all of it because I did, felt like we needed to move forward. And, again, no opposition to bike lanes on Avenue B. I did sort of have a problem with that just immediately going to the contractor, but that would have been separate. I think it would have then had to go back to the audit committee. They would have done more deliberation. And I know that Councilman Perry, who is the chair of that committee, really just wanted to move forward.
Why do you think you kind of faced that? It sounds like you feel like you faced a bit of resistance on the committee side. You were asking for this information. You were asking for these briefings. You were asking to basically put it to vote at the committee level and then to council. I mean, why do you think you faced that?
Well, partly because the staff wouldn't present the information that I was asking for. And I think that therefore the council, being so heavily reliant on staff recommendation, just tended to go with what the staff was presenting, even though I had asked on multiple occasions to bring back something different. And so we never really got to see that thoroughly. And I think by the third time they bring it forward. And then the staff also added another issue to the equation about the zoning changes that needed to happen in that area as well. So it's just one thing after another. It's delaying the project. Everybody's sort of tired of hearing about it and wants to get on with their lives. And for me, just being that it really was such an important, critical issue for the future of our city, I felt like it really demanded a lot of attention. It was also $50 million of taxpayer-approved money, which if we're going to spend time on anything, it should be those kind of issues.
And you're the chair of the Transportation and Mobility Committee, and another member of the committee, Ana Sandoval, had made a motion to be able to move that discussion about Broadway bike lanes forward and to the full council, and that was kind of shut down. And I mean, it got into this issue of whether it was that issue was for briefing only or for action could be taken. And I know that you wanted it to be an action item, and there were questions about why that didn't happen. But I wondered if after that meeting, because I know she was frustrated and I know you were frustrated, have you had a chance to talk to Eric Walsh, the city manager, about what happened and what we can learn from that whole process?
Well, so one very simple change that was made was that every agenda item is for briefing or action, which they almost always are. So why mine was scheduled only for a briefing was equally infuriating. And then, of course, when Ed Guzman says, well, you can take action if you want, I thought, well, then why are you standing here? Why did you block the motion if we can take action anyway? Mm-hmm. And so I think all the council members get very nervous when the lawyers in the room are telling you to behave a certain way. And also just even going back when, our traffic engineers are telling you this design is not safe, which again is not true. It declines the level of service, which is very different from, is this a safe option? Right. So again, like council members, especially new council members, are going to get nervous when your attorneys say don't take action and your traffic engineers tell you this action is dangerous.
Well, I'm curious, what are you basing your idea about the lack of a safety concern on? What did you, because the engineers are saying there is a safety issue.
Right, and it's just, again, like it's not a safety issue. It's an issue of level of service. So they're saying that we can't have this level of service and have bike lanes here. Right. The reality is you can reduce level of service. We could have gone down to 3 lanes.
But I'm saying, what is the evidence that you have to show that it's not a safety concern?
Protected bike lanes with a buffer are always going to be a safe option for people who are using bicycles. Anytime you can have a separated space, it's going to be the safest option. So whether is actually on Broadway and you have a buffered space is going to be very safe. Removing them altogether is also safe, but we also know that cyclists are going to continue to use Broadway as a thoroughfare because it's the most direct route.
And what did you decide was the real issue that the opposition was actually concerned about? Was it appeasing the business owners on Lower Broadway? Why was the opposition so firm?
Well, part of it was that it was very heavily developer influenced. And I mean, I experienced it myself, that there was so much development on that particular development
upcoming
participation in all the bond committee meetings, because I've been to many bond committee meetings in my life. I've never seen one that was so heavily developer driven like the issue on Lower Broadway.
And the developers did not want the bike lanes?
No, it's not. I don't think that I think that they would have been open to the idea of bike lanes on Lower Broadway. What it was is that then our city staff came forward with a recommendation saying that it wasn't a safe option. And so that's why I keep going back to our city staff making decisions that are not policy driven, that are strictly related to level of service, that are going to continue to give us an environment where all we're doing is prioritize single occupancy vehicles.
I wanted to get a chance to talk to you. You mentioned earlier that you're term limited out. And you will be one of the few council members since we expanded term limits in 2008 who will make it through 4 2-year terms. I think Ray Lopez, Ray Saldana, and then is Rebecca Villagrán and you? Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
So I know we're you just got reelected a few months ago, so I'm jumping the gun here. But since we got you here on the podcast, you probably deal with a lot of speculation, but any thoughts about where you go from here in 2021 when your fourth term ends, and any political plans or thoughts that you have?
Well, I'm keeping the door open, and it has been such an incredible learning experience, and I feel like I'm just started to get really good at this job. I always knew that I was my heart was in the right place, but I finally figured out more of the policy decisions that are so impactful for our city long term. And of course, it takes a while to get confident as well. So I feel like I'm finally there, and it's unfortunate that, when is term limited. I say that now, although 4 years ago I would have probably said, thank God for term limits. But but now that we're here, I feel like an urgency to move on some of these policy decisions. That's why I think the issue of Broadway was so important, because, again, we've got to change the way that we design our city. And then starting to really have a council that's more supportive of issues that were always a concern of mine, women's equity, housing, poverty, and all those things. So I hope that there is a political future for me. I don't really know where that will go. But in my planning, not so long ago, I imagined that Commissioner Elizondo would have served his term.
Right.
It would have been perfect timing for me. I would have run for an open seat for the county commissioner spot. And so now, of course, we have Justin there, who's doing a fine job, and I don't feel any need to challenge Justin at this point. So we'll see. I think I like municipal government. I'm not as interested in the statewide offices. Right. Trey Martinez is my representative, so he's just back in his position. So I don't know. There's not that many positions that are available, but I do like being in municipal government.
Well, again, we want to thank you so much for joining us, and best of luck over the next year and a half you got?
Yeah, a year and a half. A lot of work to be done.
And thank you all for listening, and hope you all have a great Thanksgiving. We'll catch up with you next week. Take care.